The taxi pulled up to the curb, and Emma Carter sat there for a moment, just breathing. Her son was 6 days old, asleep in his car seat, his tiny fist curled against his cheek. She was exhausted in a way she'd never known a body could be exhausted, stitched and sore and running on maybe 11 hours of sleep spread across a week. But she was smiling. She was finally bringing her baby home. She unbuckled the car seat with careful, practiced hands, thanked the driver, and made her way up the familiar walkway to the house she had lived in for the last 8 years, the house she had paid the mortgage on every single month since her father passed. She balanced the car seat on one hip, her hospital bag on the other shoulder, and reached for her key. It didn't fit. She tried again, jiggling it the way you do when you assume it's just stiff, just cold, just being difficult. It didn't turn. She stepped back and looked at the door like it might explain itself. Brand new brass, gleaming, unfamiliar. Someone had changed the locks. She knocked, waited, knocked again. Finally, the door opened, and there stood her mother, Linda, arms already crossed, her expression flat and unmoved, as though she'd been waiting behind that door composing herself for this exact moment. "Mom, why won't my key work?" Linda didn't invite her in. She stood in the doorway like a wall. "This isn't your house anymore, Emma. Jason needs it more than you do." For a second, Emma actually laughed, thinking it was some kind of misunderstanding, a joke landing badly. Then she saw her mother's face and understood there was no joke in it at all. "Mom, I pay the mortgage. I've paid it for years. I paid for the roof, the renovations, Dad's medical bills, everything. What are you talking about? Jason has a wife. He has a family to raise. You're young. You'll figure something out." Linda's voice was calm, rehearsed, like she'd practiced this speech in the mirror. "Your brother needs stability. You always land on your feet." Before Emma could respond, the door opened wider and 2 black trash bags came sailing out onto the porch, landing with a soft thud near her feet. Diapers, bottles. The little going-home outfit Emma had picked out months ago spilled halfway out of the top of one bag. "Take your things and go," Linda said. "I already told Jason you'd understand." Emma stood frozen, her newborn son beginning to stir and fuss in his car seat, sensing the tension in the cold morning air. Across the street, Mrs. Alvarez, who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, stepped out onto her own porch, drawn by the noise. 2 teenagers on bikes slowed to a stop at the end of the driveway, staring. A jogger paused mid-stride. Emma felt her face burn with a humiliation she hadn't experienced since childhood, being discarded, publicly with a baby in her arms, on the porch of a house she had bled money into for years. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice shaking now. "I have a newborn. Where exactly am I supposed to go?" Linda's eyes flickered, just for a second, something that might have been guilt passing behind them before it hardened again. "You'll figure it out. You always do." And then the door closed. Emma heard the deadbolt turn, the same sound, she would realize weeks later, of a lock clicking shut on a lifetime of assumptions she'd never once questioned. She stood on that porch with her sleeping son, 2 trash bags of baby supplies, and a hospital bag, while the neighborhood quietly watched a woman get thrown out of her own home. She didn't cry. Not yet. She picked up the bags, one at a time, and carried her son back to the curb and called the only person she could think of, her college roommate Sarah, who still lived 20 minutes away and had a spare room. It would be weeks before Emma understood just how long this betrayal had been building and just how badly her mother and brother had underestimated her. To understand how Emma ended up on that porch, you have to go back 4 years, to the week her father, Robert Carter, died of a sudden heart attack in the garage he'd spent 30 years fixing up. Emma was 27 then, single, working as a project coordinator at a mid-sized firm. Jason was already married to Melissa, already busy with 2 young kids, already, in their mother's eyes, the one who had enough on his plate. So it was Emma who quietly stepped in. She took on a second job doing freelance bookkeeping on weekends, and every month, without complaint, she covered the mortgage payment on the family house so her grieving mother wouldn't lose it. She paid the property taxes when they came due. She paid for the roof repair after a bad storm. She covered emergency dental work, a hospital stay, months of medication her mother needed after her blood pressure spiked from the stress of grief. Linda cried gratefully in those early months. She told Emma constantly how she didn't know what she'd do without her, how Emma was such a good daughter, how she wished Jason could be even half as reliable. Emma believed every word of it because she wanted to believe it, because taking care of her mother felt like taking care of a piece of her father too. At some point, Emma couldn't even remember exactly when, her mother suggested it would be simpler if the utilities were registered under Emma's name, since Emma was the one paying them anyway, and it would help with some tax paperwork Linda didn't want to deal with. Emma didn't think twice. She trusted her mother completely. She trusted her whole family. She had no reason not to. She never once thought to ask who was actually on the deed. After the porch, Emma spent 3 nights on Sarah's pull-out couch, nursing her son in the dark, trying to process what had happened. It wasn't until the 4th day, when she finally had the energy to think clearly instead of just survive, that she remembered the old filing box she'd taken from the house months earlier. Bank records, tax documents, insurance papers, things she'd meant to organize someday. She dug through it that night after the baby finally settled into a deep sleep. Mortgage statements with her name on the payment history. Years of property tax receipts, all paid from her account. Insurance documents, records of bank transfers going back to the year her father died. And then, near the bottom of the box, something she'd never really looked closely at before. A copy of the property deed. Her mother's name was on it. But it wasn't the only name. Emma stared at the second name on that deed for a long, long moment, her heart pounding somewhere up in her throat. It wasn't Jason's name either. It was the name of a trust, the Robert J. Carter Family Trust. Her father's lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Harold Whitfield, who had handled the Carter family's affairs for over 20 years, remembered Emma the second she walked into his office. He'd known her since she was a teenager, tagging along with her father to sign paperwork. "I always wondered when this conversation would happen," he said, pulling a thick folder from his cabinet before she'd even finished explaining what happened on the porch. What he told her rearranged everything she thought she understood about her family. Her father, in the years before his death, had grown quietly concerned about how the house would be handled after he was gone. He loved Linda, but he also knew her, knew how easily she could be swayed by whoever was standing closest and speaking loudest, and he suspected, even then, that Jason and Melissa had a way of doing exactly that. So instead of leaving the house outright to his wife, he'd placed it into a family trust. Linda was granted a lifetime right to live in the home, but the majority ownership, 60%, had been placed in Emma's name, to be fully released to her once she turned 30 or had her first child, whichever came first. "Your father wanted to make sure the person who actually cared for this family and this house would be protected," Harold said gently. "He talked about you a great deal in those meetings, Emma. He worried Jason would try to take advantage of your mother eventually. It seems he was right to worry." Emma sat in stunned silence. Her mother had known. Her mother had to have known, all these years, exactly what that deed said, and had let Emma pour her savings, her time, her exhaustion, into a house she was quietly plotting to hand over to someone else the moment it was convenient. And worse, Harold confirmed that Jason had been informed of the trust's terms over a year earlier when he'd contacted the firm asking about his inheritance. He knew Emma had majority ownership. He knew all along, and he'd said nothing, letting his mother stage an eviction against a woman 6 days postpartum, betting that Emma wouldn't fight back. He'd bet wrong. Emma didn't yell. She didn't cry in front of anyone again. She hired an attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla Nguyen, who specialized in trust and estate disputes. And within a week, they had filed an emergency injunction preventing Linda or Jason from making any further changes to the property, from selling it, refinancing it, or transferring any portion of it. They filed a formal ownership claim asserting Emma's rights under the trust. And when Priscilla dug into the bank records Emma provided, she found something else. Unauthorized transfers out of a joint account Emma hadn't realized her mother still had partial access to. Small amounts moved over several months, always just under the threshold that might trigger the bank's fraud alerts. They froze what remained of it within days. Word travels fast in families like Emma's. Within 2 weeks, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Her mother called first, her voice thick with tears, saying she never meant for it to go this far, that she just wanted to help Jason, that surely Emma could understand a mother wanting to help her son. "You put my newborn's things in trash bags, Mom," Emma said quietly, and hung up. Jason's calls were angrier. He accused her of trying to destroy the family over money, of being cold, of turning her back on her own mother in her time of need. He threatened, more than once, to sue her for interfering with the family estate, a threat his own lawyer would later quietly advise him to drop, since there was no estate for him to claim in the first place. Melissa posted vague, wounded messages on social media about greedy relatives and some people only caring about themselves, never naming Emma directly but clearly aiming at her. Aunts and cousins Emma hadn't spoken to in years suddenly resurfaced with opinions, calling her selfish, ungrateful, cruel to do this to her own mother while claiming to love her father's memory. Emma didn't argue with any of them. Instead, she compiled everything, the trust documents, the payment history, the deed, a simple timeline, into a single PDF, and sent it to every relative who had something to say. The messages stopped within a day. A few relatives even called to quietly apologize, admitting they hadn't known the real story, that Linda had told a very different version of events. One aunt admitted she always suspected Linda favored Jason, but never imagined it went this far. The court date came 6 weeks later. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table with Priscilla, her son asleep in a carrier at her feet, dressed simply calmly, nothing performative about her at all. Across the room, Linda sat beside a lawyer Jason had hired, refusing to look in Emma's direction. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Ferreira, went through the evidence methodically. Years of mortgage statements, tax records, the medical bills, the renovation invoices, all traced back to Emma's accounts. She reviewed the trust document, Robert Carter's clear and unambiguous intentions written in his own attorney's careful language. She reviewed the bank transfer records Priscilla had flagged. When Linda was asked to explain her reasoning for changing the locks and removing Emma from the property, she faltered, then finally said, quietly, that she wanted Jason to have the house because he has a family. He needs the stability more. Ms. Carter, the judge said evenly, your daughter has a family too. She has an infant son, and by every financial record in front of me, she has been solely responsible for maintaining this property for the last 4 years, while holding legal majority ownership under a valid trust established by your late husband. I'm struggling to understand the justification here. Linda had no answer for that. The ruling came the following week. Emma was confirmed as the rightful majority owner of the property under her father's trust. Jason was ordered to vacate any claim or presence tied to ownership. Linda retained her lifetime right to reside in the home only under terms Emma would set, not the other way around. And the court ordered reimbursement for several of the unauthorized transfers that had been made from the joint account. Emma didn't celebrate. She simply felt, for the first time in months, like she could finally exhale. She moved back into the house 3 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning, her son, 6 months old now, babbling and reaching for the doorframe as she carried him inside. The first thing she did wasn't unpack boxes. It was walk into the small spare room at the end of the hall, the one her father used to talk about turning into a proper nursery someday, if you kids ever give me grandbabies. And she stood there for a long moment, imagining the pale yellow walls, the little reading chair, the mobile of stars he used to sketch on napkins when he was bored during football games. She spent the next month bringing that sketch to life piece by piece. She set boundaries with the relatives who doubted her, calmly and without apology. Some drifted back in, humbled, others stayed away, and she let them. Her mother remained in the house under Emma's terms, quieter now, more careful. The balance of power between them permanently and irreversibly shifted. Jason didn't speak to her for the better part of a year, and when he finally did, it was a short, stiff apology that felt more like damage control than sincerity. Emma accepted it politely and kept her distance anyway. On the nursery's last afternoon of painting, with her son asleep in the next room and the smell of fresh paint drifting through the open window, Emma sat down on the floor and looked around at the space her father had once only dreamed about out loud. She thought about the porch, the trash bags, the neighbors watching, her mother's flat, unmoved face. The day my mother threw me out, she believed she'd taken my future. She never realized she had handed me the proof I needed to protect everything my father had left behind.